This is Martin Pietrzak from LandWorks. Welcome once again to the Anatomy of the Penetration Test webinar. This will be an interactive discussion and demonstration between Eric Rutkowski, the president of LandWorks, as well as Richard Rogerson, a certified penetration tester. So this, because it's an interactive session, we highly encourage you to pose your questions or comments in the questions module to the right-hand side of the panel. Please submit them. We'll be addressing them as many as possible at the end of the session, however, and then we'll be prioritizing them as we go. If we do not have an opportunity to address every single question, do not worry. One of our experts will follow up with you with an answer that you may be looking for. So once again, we'll be happy to know, by the way, there's no PowerPoint today, just one picture. It's really all about the know-how and the two experts that we have here today. So let's get started. Eric, over to you.
Thanks very much, Martin. Martin, I have joining with me Richard Rogerson, as you introduced, a certified penetration tester. Thanks for joining, Richard.
Thanks for having me.
So just to frame things a little bit here, there are a number of different types of pen tests. There's an external pen test, there's an external pen test with credentials, there's an internal pen test with no credentials, internal with credentials. What we're going to be doing here today is essentially an internal pen test with no credentials. So I liken that to you're in the lobby of an organization. You don't really know who works here. You don't have any passwords. You don't have any credentials. So we're just skipping just a little bit. We've gone through the firewall slightly, but we just, as I said, know very little about the organization. The environment under test, and this will be all live with Richard doing this, is all under servers under AWS. So I'll just start out with a quick question to you, Richard, is, you know, a pen test, like what's the importance of it and what is a pen test?
Great question. So yeah, to kick things off, so a penetration test is where you would hire an ethical hacking group to try and break into an organization, understand the vulnerabilities. And the point of understanding the vulnerabilities is really to understand the impact. So it's really looking to identify as many vulnerabilities in a customer network, and as well the impact of those vulnerabilities on their network. So could someone leverage a vulnerability to obtain unauthorized access? And it's really helping to answer some of those questions. And the real purpose of a pen test is to help prepare an organization for a breach and to help them avoid a breach by really understanding the open doors, the back door and the side door, and really understanding the risk of those pieces.
Okay. So what are some of the common certifications for a pen tester that makes you actually quite effective as opposed to just a textbook person?
That's such an amazing question. So there's a lot of different certifications in the pen testing realm. And I'm going to address the question in really two pieces. So first, the web application side. When you're testing web applications, it's much different. So there's two main certifications that come to mind here. So there's what's called the GWAP. It's a mouthful, but what does that mean? So it's the GIAC Web Application Penetration Testing Certification. So that's one that's offered by the GIAC organization. Very expensive course, I believe it's roughly 10,000 Canadian dollars. And the second one is the OSWE. So Offensive Security is one of the leaders in practical evaluation for cybersecurity training. So not the textbook, it's more hands-on keyboard, demonstrate, show us what you can do. So they offer the Offensive Security Web Expert certification. That's an incredibly difficult certification. On the infrastructure side, and that's what we're talking about today, there's a number as well. So there's two from GIAC. So there's the GIAC Certified Penetration Tester, so it's called GPEN, and that's a great entry-level kind of certification. It is paper-based, but there's also practical components to the SANS courses, as there always is. GXPN is another one. So it's the GIAC Exploit Researcher and Advanced Penetration Testers. That's a lot more in-depth. It's like writing exploit code and playing with debuggers and disassemblers and really understanding the guts of applications in a 32 and 64-bit architecture and understanding how could we play with those different pieces. But then there's 3 other ones. And these 3 ones are the ones that really help drive and ensure that the pen tester is effective. The first is the OSCP. That's a 24-hour practical certification exam where sleep is optional. OSCP is the newer one. It's the Offensive Security Experience Penetration Tester. That's a 48-hour exam. Again, sleep is optional. And then finally, there's the OSED. It's similar to the GXPN, but it's the Offensive Security Exploit Developer. It's really finding vulnerabilities like the 0 days and really writing the code to exploit those vulnerabilities and obtaining unauthorized access. But if I were to pick one for the requirement for a pen test, it would be the OSCP. That's the one that really has a well-rounded basis.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. Not to jump right to the conclusion or anything like that, but is there any kind of commonality of that you see when you're doing an external or internal pen test that is just a common vulnerability that everybody that's on this webinar should be aware of that you see?
There's a lot. And I think we all understand that missing patches is obviously the one that comes first to mind. We forgot to apply the patch. That patch addresses a security vulnerability. That's the first one. But I think even if we address that one, we still have legacy protocols. So sometimes what happens is we patch our systems, but then we forget about the legacy protocols that are in place. NetBIOS is an example. We see NetBIOS in a lot of environments, and that's the failback to DNS. If I can't look up the print server that I'm trying to connect to, it's going to fail back to a lot of these legacy protocols, and that's where an attacker can kind of take the man in the middle position and really take advantage and potentially compromise your credentials. On the web side, we see a lot of injection, cross-site scripting, and a lot of business logic vulnerabilities, especially in e-commerce platforms. But missing patches is by far the most common that we do see.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Moving forward then, if you could just put up the slide, Richard, that is the various phases of a pen test. Okay, so I can see here there's 5 essential phases here. So the first one, it starts in the upper right-hand corner with the discovery recon. And really, I liken that to effectively walking down the street, looking what kind of lock this house has. Is there any doors that are kind of open a bit or a window that's open a bit? And you're just kind of mapping out and looking what's, what things that you want to focus on. The next thing, automated testing. This is where you're using a tool to check it against patches and such, and we're going to get there. The manual testing, that's where you've now kind of looked at stuff, you've kind of figured out a few things, and you want to poke in a little bit deeper. And then exploitation, the second last one here. I guess you're kind of looking to see if you can get further inside and attack other systems and get at other systems once you've exploited one of them. And then I guess the final thing here you've got is report and analysis, and that's where you're providing the customer the information they need to harden and fix the openings that they do have and prevent anything further. So yeah. What we'll do is we'll dive into these one by one. And kind of with some examples, and the first one obviously being the recon and mapping. So I guess this is where you're running something like Nmap. If you could maybe throw up a screen and kind of show us just what that recon quickly looks like.
Yeah, so if we were to start, so on this screen right now, this is a Kali Linux virtual machine. Kali Linux is the de facto operating system of choice for a lot of ethical hackers because it has a lot of the tools that we would likely expect. Nmap is a tool that will look for open ports, and that's really the beginning of a pen test. I mean, it's looking for all the open doors, and you likened it to the drive-by almost, right? Like you're walking by a neighborhood and you're looking for open doors. Maybe those are in the front or the back or the side, but either way, this is the process and the tool that is used. Nmap is a very capable tool. There's a lot of different things that it can test for. It has scripts, it has different service enumeration techniques, and overall, it's a very comprehensive tool. We're going to run this in a lab environment. Go ahead, sorry.
I use it all the time, actually. I use the GUI version of it, which is ZenMap, and it's just so easy to use, and it actually gives you a lot of information about a host and what operating system, what ports are open. very, very valuable in doing any kind of reconnaissance on an environment.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
if you could maybe just
And
quickly go over what you just see on the screen right now.
yeah. So if we look at the host that we see, so this is our lab environment, and there's a number of different ports, but we see some that we do recognize. So 3389, this we recognize as remote desktop protocol. So that would be one we'd find on a Microsoft Windows host. This one over here has got a lot of different services: DNS, RPC, LDAP. This looks like a domain controller. Below that, you're going to see some others. And this looks like a pretty traditional Windows server. You know, we see RPC, NetBIOS, 445, you know, RDP as well. And then down below, we see one that only has port 21 open. It also has, you know, RPC as well, but this one looks like a Linux host. But the purpose of Nmap is to really find these open ports, and then it really helps us understand the lay of the land. What are the systems that we see in the environment? And what could we do with some of these vulnerabilities? So we would look and say, well, port 22, that's the host that is Linux. So maybe we'll look and potentially brute force that port. But we also see RDP, and RDP is another one that allows for authentication. So we could look at that one as well. But that's really Nmap kind of the overview, and just, you know, looking through the results.
So now that you've kind of, you see what doors are open ajar or what windows are slightly open, you see what kind of lock is front and back, you're going to typically now do an automated test at this point, right? With either Nessus or Qualys or products like that. Could you maybe bring that up and quickly show us that?
Sure. So what we're doing right now, this is a Nessus instance. For the webinar, we've pre-run the scan just so we don't have to wait for it to run. Some of these scans, they take time. As you can see, this one was just run today, and it did take 8 minutes in duration. So obviously having everybody wait 8 minutes while this runs is not productive. So we pre-ran this just, you know, to save some time. You'll see here that we also see the same host that we saw before, but now instead of just seeing ports, we're actually seeing vulnerabilities. So we can see here, we see 1 high risk vulnerability, 5 medium, and a bunch of info. But in order to make sense of this, we've got to drill down. So this is where we would go into the vulnerabilities or the VPR top threats. Either way, this is going to show us the vulnerabilities that are on this system. If we click on one as an example, we can drill down and we can see, what is this vulnerability? You know, what could be done with it? Could someone obtain unauthorized access? We see here it's a high severity, so we know it's a problem that we definitely need to look into. As well, it gives us risk level information on the side over here to describe, you know, how does this score on, say, a CVSS type benchmark. As well, it gives you the solution. Not even that, it gives you the security bulletin. So you can actually click on this link, find the patch, and apply that patch to the system. So we know that this one is vulnerable. After we patch it, we can run the scan again and be able to verify that that patch has been applied, and as well the risk has been mitigated.
Okay.
So at a high level, that's what a vulnerability scan looks like.
Okay, cool. So now that you've got some of the vulnerabilities identified because it's a lack of patches or misconfiguration, et cetera, you're kind of going to go now and see how much more of that you know, you can kind of dig into, or, you know, peel another layer off by doing some manual testing. Could you maybe show us that really quick too?
Yeah, so with manual testing, we would look at these different systems and go in and say, you know, of these systems, what's running on these different ports? So this would be where we would actually connect into these different ports and protocols and really understand what's there, what's running. So here we see RDP on this host, and it's running an insecure version of the SSL algorithm, or protocol rather. For the manual testing, we're actually going to save that for the exploit phase, where we're going to go through and run a number of different attacks. But for manual testing, essentially what happens is we take the vulnerability scan, we review the results, and we determine, are any of these vulnerabilities ones that warrant additional effort? As well, any of the ports that were not understood by the vulnerability scanner. So any of those services that the vulnerability scanner just says, you know, I gave up, or there was nothing I could find, it may be a custom protocol. That would be where the attacker the pen tester, is going through and connecting to each and every one of those ports and running different tools to really understand, can we exploit this vulnerability? So in the instance of, say, a VPN type vulnerability, we would run something like a tool called IkeScan. They would see, can we pull back the handshake for the SSL connection, and then we'd be able to brute force that. We don't have an actual demo set up for this phase of the manual testing, but I think we should talk about that once we get into the exploitation phase, because we've got a couple demos that we should share.
Okay, so well, let's just jump into exploitation then. This is kind of more of the fun part, you know, where you're trying to guess passwords, get a privileged credential, you know, finding out how to get past the lobby essentially of that building. So if you want to maybe show us a few things there.
Sure, absolutely. So with this, we looked at this vulnerability scan and we didn't see much here, right? We saw a number of different hosts, and there were some that were, you know, high, but those vulnerabilities require client-side access. We're in the lobby of the building, so there's no real way for us to try and pull off that unless we're sending phishing emails. For the purpose of this demo, we looked and said, well, what about authentication? We need to authenticate to these different systems, and vulnerability scanners will try to run different default passwords and see if there are any default passwords. But we're going to jump into a part of the demo where we're going to actually walk through and do a brute force attack on remote desktop protocol. Remote desktop protocol, RDP, is a potentially vulnerable protocol because it's a very beefy protocol. There's a lot to it. The reason we're targeting the administrator account is the local administrator on most Windows systems does not lock out by default. So you think about an Active Directory, you've got thresholds. So after 5 failed logon attempts, we're going to lock the account. That makes it a lot more difficult for an attacker because after guessing or trying 5 different passwords, we get locked out and we're stuck. The local administrator doesn't have that restriction, and that's why we often recommend changing the local administrator from administrator to something different. But for the purpose of this, we're going to actually attack the administrator account. I've pre-written a password list, and in that password list, we choose our 5 most favorite passwords: spring 2020, fall 2020, winter 2020, and you know, the other one is COVID 2020. I don't know why, but this is such a common password that we're finding in organizations nowadays. You know, the pandemic has really changed the way that people think about passwords. But for this, we're going to run this. So we're targeting all of the systems in our lab environment. We're going to use the RDP protocol, and we're going to try that password list. So when I hit enter, it's going to try. It's going to fail a lot of times, but look, we got one. So at the bottom, you can actually see, and that's the 3389, that same port that we saw in the Nmap scan. We know it's RDP. We've found that that password does work. We have the administrator password, and the password is COVID 2020. Now, this environment had password complexity requirements. So what does that mean? We have an uppercase and we have an exclamation mark on the end. So this password is one that would work in the environment. So we can actually leverage this credential to log into the affected system.
Now, Richard, the internet does have password databases, does it not? Where you can actually funnel in a password file that's readily available out in the internet, and it will just relentlessly hit that domain controller, the local admin, and it will never be locked out. As long as it has access to it, it'll just keep hitting it and hitting it and hitting it with a dictionary hack and the suggested ones in the database until it actually finds something. Is that what you're seeing out there?
Yeah, absolutely. And what we find is that whenever an organization is compromised, those passwords end up on a list. That list is then leveraged. So say people come up with creative passwords, password 1, password 2, welcome 1, spring 2020. All of these passwords end up in a password list. And within Kali Linux, there's a couple password lists. And as well, if you go out to the internet, you can find password lists of all of the different passwords that have been compromised. I believe there's one that you can unpack it, and I believe it's 10 to 20 gigabytes in length, and it's 1.2 billion passwords, not million, billion passwords. These are all going to be potentially complex or passphrases, but it's going to be a lot of different words. It could be names, it could be a lot of different things. But those are all going to be passwords that we're going to attempt. And the reason that we use those is those are passwords that were found to work in other environments. So we know that someone has already set that password. That's a compromised password. So what better to choose from is a list of previously compromised passwords. And that's what we could leverage. We could leverage a known password list to target an organization and really understand, are they using any of those previously compromised passwords?
Okay.
That helps them twofold. Yeah, so they understand if their passwords have been compromised, but they also pick up on whether there's weak passwords in the environment.
So now that you have this administrator login, but this is a local admin, you're going to want to do some lateral movement into the network, and because this local admin is not going to give you that much access to do damage, whether it be exfiltrate data. Yes, you can do it locally from this machine, but it doesn't give you, it's not the keys to the castle. You want to try to get the AD privileged credential. Is that not correct?
Yeah. So this one is a bit harder to see. So this one, so there's a tool called Mimikatz, and it's one, we're going to run this on the domain controller just to make things easy, but the domain controller is one that would have a lot more passwords than just a couple. Now, Mimikatz is a tool that exploits a number of different vulnerabilities, but the one that immediately comes to mind is wdigest. So wdigest, if you're not familiar, wdigest is a protocol that is used for web authentication. The challenge with the implementation within Microsoft Windows is that the key to unlock the encrypted passwords in memory is stored in the same envelope as the encrypted password. So it's like they're two pieces to the puzzle are side by side. So if we use a tool like Mimikatz, we're actually able to dump those passwords right out of memory. And what I'm going to show today is just running Mimikatz. We're going to actually dump any of the credentials that we can find. Let's pasting from my buffer. So we start off by saying privilege debug. Gonna make sure we have the right, ooh, I can't type. Privilege debug, and we get a 20, okay. So that means that we have enough permission on this network to run this command. And then the third one, the second one we're gonna run is secure, it's written kind of funny, LSA. LSA is the logon service for Microsoft Windows. And we're going to dump the logon password. So when I hit enter, there's going to be a whole bunch of things scrolling on the screen. It's going to be looking to say, what are the cache credentials? Are there any other, am I going to be able to find anything in wdigest? And it's going to look for a number of others. But what we're going to find is an NTLM password hash that we'll crack after. So if I just hit enter, you see it scrolling on the screen. There's a bunch of stuff here. If we look through this and we scroll up far enough, we're going to see, oh, here's a computer object. Here's another one, and we're going to be looking for a password hash, and you can kind of see somewhere here, you're going to find it. And on a large customer network, there would be a lot of accounts here. The challenge that we find is in an environment that it hasn't been hardened. The default setting for Microsoft Windows is to cache 10 logons. So you think about an end user workstation. You call in to support and you say, I need help with my laptop, and the domain admin potentially will log in and take a look at your system. The challenge with cache credentials is they store 10 by default. So the last 10 people who logged into your workstation at your office, their passwords are all cached. And the reason they're cached is that if you're disconnected from a domain controller, you're not in the office network, you need to be able to log into your laptop. But 10 is a long list. That's a number of different passwords that could be leveraged in the environment. So the password that we did compromise here is the webinar. This is the domain that we've set up here. We've got the NTLM hash for that user. So what we can do with this, because we don't have it set up with wdigest, we can actually crack this password. So what I'm going to do is flip over to Kali now that we have this hash. And I'm going to share that. So over here, we've taken that hash, that NTLM hash we had on the screen that Mimikatz had,
Yep.
and we're going to run it against Hashcat. So Hashcat on a production pen test, on a full-fledged pen test engagement that we were delivering on, we would use Hashcat with a GPU rig. So the graphics processing chips that are the same ones that are used for crypto mining and the same ones that are used for video games, we leverage the compute engines on those cards to crack hashes. And they're much faster than traditional CPUs. For the sake of this demo, we're going to run it on a regular CPU, but this would run much, much faster. And you could see immediately the password was compromised because I cheated and I put the password in the word list that we were checking. But basically what happens is when we're setting up and we're running a password campaign, you see the password here, we would be using a GPU rig. And it's not running at, this is running on a CPU, there's only 1,000 hashes per second. On a GPU rig, we would see millions of attempts per second. So you think about that word list, 1.2 billion, we could do that very quickly. And sometimes we'll run an entire Active Directory database in a matter of minutes, and we'll compromise 30% of the credentials that are there. And that's where things get quite damaging, because we can look and analyze the passwords, understand if there's any similarities, or as well, you may get a lot more privileged access on the network. The challenge with having people's passwords is you can log in as them and they don't know. Again, we tell people to change their password on a regular basis, and that would help prevent against that. But either way, we're going to have their existing passwords. We're going to crack a lot of those, and we'll be able to see what is the real plaintext password. What are the credentials they use to log in? And that's going to help us as the attackers really launch the next attacks. For this example, it's game over.
The tools that you're using here, correct me if I'm wrong, but these are available to any 16-year-old kid that is in Canada, the US, Russia. Really all they have to do is speak English, right? And really they have a lot of these tools out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing that's interesting about Kali Linux is they even have a kids version of Kali Linux. I didn't know if you know that. So they have it in the, to train young kids and to help them understand computers and the way that they work. They could be, as with all tools, they can fall into the wrong hands and be used on the wrong side of the equation. Like Metasploit is an example, could be used by the good guys and the bad guys. Nessus, same thing. Bloodhound, same thing. And a lot of these tools, if they fall into the wrong hands, then they make it fairly easy for an attacker to launch a sophisticated attack and really take advantage of a vulnerability in a customer's network.
Mm-hmm. So we've kind of gone through and maybe scared a lot of people here, but there are ways to prevent some of this. So, a lot of environments that have not been patched, have not been updated, would be vulnerable to exactly what you have just exploited right now. But Server 2012 or ADs 2012 have like what's it called? It's a privileged group that you can't use Mimikatz on them, and there are ways of eliminating some of the vectors that the perpetrators would be using by just following best practices in your network.
Exactly. Yeah, great point. And the one point worth making as well is that it's defense in depth. There's no silver bullets. There's no shiny tools. There's layers of security, right? So that's why we recommend testing in our networks, because it helps us understand what are the attacker going to see. What is the attacker going to see in our environment? How could those vulnerabilities be leveraged to gain unauthorized access on our networks? And as well, we put the pieces together as we have and expand our defense in depth. We're making it more and more difficult for an attacker. So you think about protecting your property. You may get a taller fence. You then may add on lights. You may add on cameras. I mean, these are all just different layers that we're adding to our security to really help deter someone who's trying to break in.
Mm-hmm. So, just to provide an aside here, like a number of or LandWorks has been reached out by a number of organizations after they've been hit with ransomware. And again, there are a whole bunch of common denominators. One of them is a Citrix server that's exposed on the internet with single factor authentication, RDP on the internet, single factor authentication. The tools were able to get through that front door and then exploit a privileged credential. Another one is, everybody has heard this, but it's so common, is a phishing email that looks identical to an Office 365 login page. And the individual, the unsuspecting individual, because it's it's a well-crafted email, they put their login credential, and of course it's tied into AD, so that's their remote access credential also. And now they've just got themselves in the front door, and assuming there's not two-factor authentication or certificates in use. And at that point, you're in the lobby. And once they were in the lobby, yeah, it takes a week or two. And I could see that from logs afterwards, but they were able to move laterally through the network and exfiltrate data, and then effectively do a crypto lock. And they were able to do that with a privileged credential once they had it, because with that, they were able to disable the antivirus. And they were able to, in some cases, eliminate or encrypt the backups. And again, another rule of thumb here that's so important: have your backup server off the domain, because if you crack that Active Directory privileged credential, you don't have access, or the perpetrator does not have access to the backups. Same thing with antivirus. If you have now a cloud-based antivirus console with two-factor authentication, it effectively eliminates the ability for that perpetrator to just disable the antivirus on the servers and have clean access to them. So there's just so many little things that add up to securing your fortress. I'll move on to the last piece here, and that's the reporting and analysis. Do you want to just touch on that? What's a report is commonly containing, and what does that look like?
Yeah, so the reports themselves, and they all vary because not everyone does it the same, but basically the reports themselves, they have an executive summary. That is exactly the way you would think what it is. It's a summary for the executives. It really demonstrates the business impact of the vulnerabilities that were found. Below that, there's going to be a technical vulnerability section. That's for the technical folks. It's really going to dive into the weeds and show you what was found, explain the vulnerability. What could you do with this? How was it found? What is the potential impact on the business? And then a narrative to really show and demonstrate what could happen. What's the impact? Instead of just saying what could happen, it's the purpose of the pen test is to really drive that home. So in the reports, it would go through and tell the story in a narrative format to really explain how could this vulnerability be used in environments. So in the example of, say, SQL injection, rather than just say you have a vulnerability in your environment that, in this application, SQL injection, it could be used to obtain access to customer data, the pen test report will drive it down and really help you understand, here's the parameter in the web application that's vulnerable. Here's us running a tool to launch this attack. Here's the databases we have access to, the effective permission we have on those databases, and here's a sample record from the table to really drive home the fact that we were there and that you have access to it. Now, the next piece is often the most important, and that's the recommendation. How do you fix this vulnerability? That's, of course, as well in the report, and it will explain how do you fix this vulnerability. It will save you the Google searches. It'll give you the guidance, the steps to reproduce, as well the steps to apply the patch, whether it's at a line of code or it's applying a Microsoft patch. It would really demonstrate those different sequences. And as well, there's an overarching section that would go through and overall relate all of the findings in the pen test to an industry standard. So rather than just say you've got problems, it will say, here's how they relate to the OWASP top 10. Here's how they relate to the critical security controls. And if there's others who would relate down to those as well, to really drive them back home and help relate them to the compliance objectives that the organization has. So like an example of PCI, they would all fall under the PCI exceptions and is where they have failed. And in other compliance requirements, it would be different. But the report itself should really be clear of what the problems are, how could they be abused by an attacker, and as well, how to fix them.
Okay. So I guess the common thing here is that you present the report to the end user, they go away, yep. They do a remediation point by point, and then I suspect that you come back and validate that, in fact, that those holes have been plugged.
Absolutely. So the retest is often the most critical piece because, you know, it's well and good to go and call out and see there's a bunch of things we got to fix, but we do nothing with it. We just got a big list of things that we didn't do anything about. So that's kind of negligence, right? So on the other side, it's, you know, we need to validate that the fixes have been implemented correctly. So when doing a retest, it's important to not just rerun the test script, that the vulnerability that failed, to not just make an assumption and say, you know, if they fix this, it's going to work out. The important part of the retest is to try and bypass the fix that was put in place. So say we've applied a patch to our application. Instead of just fixing all of the attacks, they fixed the one example given. We're going to try and evaluate, has it fixed it for everything? If it has, it's mitigated the risk that the finding has been closed. We can actually close it off from the report. And we give them the evidence to really help them understand and verify that the fix has been implemented correctly. Mm-hmm. And that's when we would update the report to indicate current state, and we'd remove the findings that have been fixed.
Right, okay. In the background here, I do have a question posted, and I'll be honest with you, Richard, I don't know the answer to it, so I'm gonna toss it your way. Does Windows use the same hash algorithm on all servers? That is, would my password hash in my AD environment be the same hash in someone else's AD environment? Doesn't Microsoft allow companies to seed their AD hashes?
I believe it does allow you to do that, but I think out of the gate, it does not. I don't believe they're hashed by default. So I guess the important part here is what's, you know, hashing. So hashing is only effective if you're using a salt. The salt is what makes that hash, and these sound crazy, right? But the salt is what makes the hash unique. So the same password with two different salts would result in two different hashes. So yeah, that would be the approach. So yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if anybody else has any questions here. Martin, has anybody posted some other things?
Eric, I just sent you one more from Dan.
Okay. Dan has asked, I'm just curious, what do you think about tools like Core Impact?
We'll take a moment of silence. Core Impact is a great tool. It is the automated pen test tool. It's a great tool, and I think what I would take from Core Impact is the research from the team. So Core Impact is a great tool, but it doesn't replace a pen tester because it is still a tool. It is, you know, still is only as good as the people who wrote it. But Core Impact, from a research perspective, they have certain exploits that are not publicly available. So certain Microsoft knowledge base patches, there's no public exploit code available, and you would only get that through the Core Impact team. We've really closed the gap here, you know, in the last few years, where majority of the vulnerabilities are really out there, and the exploits for them as well. But Core Impact definitely has that distinction where there's certain exploits they have that others don't. So that I would say is the fit there. But Core Impact, for those who don't know, is a tool that can be used to run an automated pen test. You put the IPs in, and you hit go, and it will just run and do its thing. But it misses a lot of the human type vulnerabilities. So understanding context of data, understanding, you know, reuse, and all of these other scenarios that really require that expert eye, it's going to miss some of those things. But it's good as a first pass. It's going to give you at least the kind of the low-hanging fruit, so to speak.
Right. Okay. Martin, is there anything else? Anybody else?
I submitted questions to you earlier from Jen. I'm not sure if you've been able to address those.
That question, I think, was from Dan.
Oh, no, Jen. Sorry, Jen, about the internal pen tester inside an office.
Yeah, I'm just trying to expand this box here. Okay. Oh, I just expanded.
There's a few questions waiting there for you.
I'm good here. Just give me a second. When an internal pen tester is inside an office, the office has implemented machine certificate-based 802.1 connection restriction on wired and Wi-Fi networks as a top step, how can the tester get connected if you cannot get Kali Linux connected to the internal network? How can he run Nmap to start with?
Printers and copiers. Those are our favorite targets. You apply 802.1x to your corporate laptop, certificate-based authentication, a whole bunch of different things, but nobody thinks about the copiers. So what do we do when we go into an engagement? We'll either be a man-in-the-middle position on a copier where we'll plug into the back of it, or we'll plug a device into the network and then that device into the copier so we can kind of have that man-in-the-middle position. But we would leverage the path of least resistance. We would find the opportunity if there's any systems that don't have certificate-based authentication, there will always be some. We will find those. We will leverage those to obtain access to the environment to be able to run a vulnerability scan. And that's similar to the way we would approach any of them. We're going to look for the path of least resistance. We're going to try and find the way that we can get into the environment and bypass the controls in place. But sometimes it's not that difficult. I've been on so many pen tests where they have great controls, but the computers are not locked when someone walks away. So that makes it easier for us as the attackers to go in and plug in things like Rubber Ducky. That sounds like a funny name, but Rubber Ducky is a tool by Hack5. It's a small little device, tiny little device, and it looks like a USB drive, but it's pre-built with commands. So you walk by a computer, you plug it in, you tap the button, and it is if you are the fastest typer in the world, it's going to spit out keystrokes at, I think, hundreds of characters per second, and it will, open the sequences, command prompt run, download the payload, execute. So if you think about it, you're going to put in a lot of effort to prevent someone from plugging into the network, and that's a great control, but there's always other opportunities for us as attackers.
Mm-hmm. But to Jin's point, who asked this question, 802.11x is a fabulous front line of defense. So what it prevents is the guy that's just comes into your boardroom waiting for somebody to come and join him in the meeting, and just plugging into the network and doing a quick scan and doing some of these things. It prevents the opportunist, really, in a lot of cases. And then having certificates, a cert-based authentication as well. That's just simply another layer. And as we, security is like an onion, and every layer is making it that much harder for the perpetrator to get through your front door. And I liken it to, my straight, I don't have to make my house Fort Knox, but I just have to make it that much harder that the guy that's going door to door is going to go to somebody else's house. So that's really, in a lot of cases, holds true. You're not going to make it perfect, but for every additional control that you put on your network, it makes it just so much harder, and there's a higher likelihood that that person is going to go next door. I have another question here. What vulnerabilities have you encountered under site-to-site VPN of Azure with respect to appliances? Does Windows use the same hash on, okay, so that was partly, so that was, sorry about that. That question is finished. What vulnerabilities have you encountered under site-to-site VPN of Azure with respect to appliances?
Specific to appliances, that's a tough question. I'll answer the question to the best of my ability, but I don't know specifically what they're after with that question. But what we find in client environments where they have site-to-site connections, we find that sometimes they open it up to a broader audience. So you think about it, if I have a database server, does the call center staff need access to the database? Probably not. So we talk about network segmentation. So what we normally find is that when we have site-to-site VPN connections, they're not as segmented as they should be. They're kind of the wide open Wild West. What we recommend in those scenarios is to implement network segmentation. So look at your end user segments and look at the different things and services and servers they're going to need to access in the Azure environment, and really building your rule sets around that. So your more sensitive servers and services like your databases and any of the others, we would restrict access into them so that someone from the regular network can't just hop into that zone. And then we would put them through something like a jump box with two-factor, just to make it a lot more difficult for someone. Again, back to the layers, making it a lot more difficult for someone to be able to get access to those systems that have really the keys to the kingdom.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Another question here, is a pen test part of a SOX or PIPED a compliance requirement?
Yeah. So there's a number of different compliance requirements that actually require a pen test. There's PCI DSS, there's HITRUST, there's SOC 2. SOC 2 requires you to do a pen test. There's ISO 27001. There's the MPA for the Motion Picture Association. There's, I think, like 10 other requirements that actually mandate that. And the thing that we're also starting to see is that the insurance companies, they're starting to ask for a pen test. They're starting to say, you want to have cyber insurance. Well, we should review your pen test report. They're going to ask for it. So there's a lot of different places that are going to be asking. We also see customers asking their vendors, their suppliers, to provide a pen test report just to really ensure that they've done their due diligence. So absolutely, yeah, there's a number of different compliance requirements that actually mandate you to do a pen test.
Right. Okay. I don't see any more questions here. Martin, if we're good with everything here, I think we can wrap it up. And thank you, Richard.
Yes, that's right. I think we have no more questions.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. If there's any questions after the fact, please forward them. My email address is really difficult. It's Eric, ERIC @landworks.com. And if there's something I can't answer, I'll certainly forward over to Richard or some of our technical team. And again, I thank everybody for joining us. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.